Everyone can hear me, yes? Hello. It's so nice to see such familiar faces today. As mentioned, I am Bridgit Antoinette Evans. I am the CEO at the Pop Culture Collaborative, which is a philanthropic fund that is working to transform the narrative oceans that are creating harm for Black and Indigenous people and all people of color, immigrants, refugees, Muslims in the US and around the world, especially those who are women and queer and trans and gender expansive, disabled. And we do that by forging bonds and really creating connective tissue with social justice movements and the entertainment industry. Now, I mentioned this word, narrative oceans. At the collaborative, we often talk about this concept, and the problem with these narrative oceans is that many of them are toxic. They are filled with terrible ideas about who we are, who belongs, who does not. Now, some of these narrative oceans and the policies that they validate are separating us from our families, preventing us from accessing critical health care. They are jailing us in prisons and detention facilities. And as we are seeing in Gaza and Israel and Congo and Chicago and Monterey Park, Atlanta, so many places, many of these narratives are getting some of us killed. So the stakes are really high. And the stories that we tell actually do matter to create new narrative oceans that generate justice and pluralist culture and help us to understand how in the next worlds that we are all involved in creating, we can behave and relate and think differently such that we can all belong here together in a foundation that is rooted in justice. So the artists that have been brought together for this conversation, entertainers as activists, they understand this really deeply. To be an artist in this world, this complex world that breaks our hearts every day and brings us joy sometimes. To be an artist in this world requires that we actually step off of the sidelines and into activism, into using our stories and our voices and our bodies each and every day to stand up to justice. And that's why I'm so excited to be able to bring them to this stage and to engage in this conversation. So let us call them in, okay? First up is Kobi Libii. Yes. Who is an actor, a writer, director, most recently seen, you're welcome to come and sit, writing and performing on Comedy Central's The Opposition with Jordan Klepper. His directorial debut feature film, The American Society of Magical Negroes, it went both through the Sundance Screenwriters and Directors Lab and is now set to release in 2024 with Focus Features. Nik Dodani, is an actor, director, producer, best known for his role as Saeed in the Netflix series Atypical, as well as roles in Dear Evan Hansen and Waitress on Broadway. He's also the co-founder of The Salon, an organization of South Asian entertainment artists and executives working to accelerate the community's cultural power and storytelling. Welcome to Nik. Richa Chadha. This is such a powerhouse panel. It's just incredible. Is an Indian actor, producer, and activist who uses her platform in Bollywood to speak out about a range of social issues, from the role of patriarchy and misogyny in driving the rise in eating disorders, and the impact of religious intolerance in India. Her first feature film as a producer, Girls Will Be Girls, is premiering in the World Dramatic Entry category at Sundance. Congratulations. and Bao Nguyen, who is an Emmy, yes, call them in, is an Emmy-nominated Vietnamese-American filmmaker whose work has been seen on HBO, Netflix, The New York Times, and ESPN, among others. His latest film, The Greatest Night in Pop, is a documentary about the making of the global hit song, We Are the World. The film is having its world premiere at this festival, and it will debut globally on Netflix on January 29th. So, this is your panel. So I'm going to ask a question of you, Kobi, and then while you're answering it, you're all going to see me struggle to sit in this seat. But please keep your attention focused on brilliant Kobi here. I wanted to start first with you in your directorial debut. It is releasing in March. It has had an incredible journey to theaters. Now, do you consider this film itself an act of activism? And if you do, how and why?
I'm a bit ambivalent about the answer to that question. So we're starting with a real definitive answer here, which is to say that I think that there's, for me, and I guess the way to start is to talk about bad political art, right? Which is to say that there is a strain of political art that I don't really respond to, that I think is not really art. There's an Ionesco quote that I'll butcher and paraphrase, which is basically like, if it could be an essay instead of a piece of art, it should probably be an essay, right? And I think part of what I'm saying with that is that from a process perspective, to me, it's really important as an artist that I'm not just thinking about politics. Right, that even though the activism and the political impact of my work, I hope is profound and I believe will be profound, from a process perspective, part of what I'm trying to do is find the intersection between my political values and what I believe is only art and uniquely art and can only be said in this medium and couldn't be said in another medium. Does that make sense as a sort of broad brush sensibility, right? So that's all to say, I don't think about this film as a piece of activism, because I think when I start making art from that perspective personally, and I know artists that feel very differently about this and can make art I think is ravishing while they're saying loud and proud I'm an activist, right? I personally think more about the artistry, and then when I sort of step back and assess the politics of it, find that there is inevitably something terrifically impactful and terrifically political about it, because as I often say, I very rarely set out to write political stories, but I'm a black man living in America, and so the fact of me telling a personal story ends up expanding the narrative ocean, that mainstream stories are often sort of splashing around in. So that's all to say, sort of.
Yeah, that's a really fine answer, and actually one that would resonate with a lot of artists in this room, right? Yeah, there's a variety, as you noted, there's a variety of ways that people enter into their art, but what you're sharing, I think, probably resonates with quite a few artists. I'm going to circle back with a follow-up question to you, but I wanted to first bring in Nik. Now, you've spoken a lot about your experiences with mental health and your experiences coming out as a queer artist and person, and I'm really curious about how that personal journey has intersected with your creative work and your embrace of activism and activist as an identity inside of your creative practice.
To be totally honest, I never set out to speak about my mental health in a way to be an activist or an advocate. The truth is a lot more actory than that. A few years ago, I was doing a movie and I was doing press for this film, and it had to do with depression and suicide. And at some point in the tour, I made a very bad joke that I was coping with the bad reviews by pumping myself with Zoloft. And much like now, that joke did not land. And so then I quickly pivoted, just being very earnest about the meds I was on. And bada bing, bada boom, I was a mental health guy. And I saw the impact that it had on some people, and so I kept talking about it. And same thing with being queer. Like, I never really set out to be an activist in that space. I just said I was queer, which ended up having kind of a similar reaction. But I do think ultimately it has impacted my art a lot. I think specifically the mental health piece of it, as an actor, as a writer, as a director. I just made my first short. Thank you. I feel like having a deeper appreciation for mental health is just so relevant to all of the work that we do in terms of being able to navigate the human psyche and just understand what motivates us and how to really kind of embody inner lives. And so I do think, while I didn't intend to be a part of these conversations, I am ultimately really happy about it. And I'm not depressed right now, so that's always nice.
You bring up a really interesting point of that, like the journey, the route that we each take into a kind of accountability to social justice and human rights is very different and varied, and it's not often that we wake up one morning and say, this is who I am. It is a evolutionary process that builds upon our personal experiences, family legacy, our experiences of injustice that just absolutely leave us no choice in some cases but to rise into that work. Richa, I'm really interested in your origin story. You are very, very powerful and effective activist and very vocal critique of a lot of social issues in India. How did you journey from being an actor in one of the world's largest, if not the largest, entertainment industries in the world, to being so deeply engaged in human rights work?
I think, so first, if you talk to anyone in India, they'll tell you I'm more on the independent side of what is popularly called Bollywood, although I do a fair bit of mainstream stuff to obviously pay the bills. But I wasn't always like this. My education is primarily as a journalist. So I was always interested in social issues. But about 10 years ago, I would say I was veering more towards anarchism than anything political. But then my country, like a lot of post-colonial countries, sort of took a very drastic turn to the right. And the minute that happens, the most marginalized in societies, women, children, and in India we have the caste system, we have religious minorities. When all of that persecution started, it made me realize you really cannot be apolitical in a scenario like that. And especially, and also what happened was, what I didn't realize was, initially everyone was speaking up and talking about issues and going to protests, but it's like I was running this race, and then slowly I realized that no one else is running along me. So what happened was I sort of got highlighted as a vocal person, as an opinionated actress. It cost me a lot of jobs. It cost me a lot of safety also. My husband and I were absconding for a month or so in 2022 over a 3-word tweet. But I think it's not so much that I am so vocal. It's just that there's such a vacuum of anything that is anti-establishment, and it's happening in real time. So the only person who speaks up kind of tends to get highlighted. And the question you get asked is, do you want to be in politics? Because a lot of actors in India turn into politicians. I think it happens in America as well. But that shouldn't be what it is. If you are a tax-paying citizen who has to vote, then you should be able to voice your opinion without politics being the only avenue for your future. So That's really the origin story. And I think my background in journalism helped me understand the issues that we were facing. And I always say it's the land of a million injustices. We have a long way to go. I'm also aware none of this change will really occur in my lifetime. But I really think that we don't do anything, it's disintegrating really fast. A lot of my colleagues have had to shift outside India. So the threat is very real. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah. Wow.
Yes.
I have to say, as somebody who's worked in pop culture for social change for my whole career, We Are the World is like right there at the heart of the DNA of my life's work, really. It was a touch point, a really iconic touch point for millions and millions of people when it was originally released. It was a moment when I think many people, particularly in the U.S., began to look over the hedges of U.S. culture and see global community differently. What was it that inspired you to go backwards and look at this momentous moment in the entertainment industry and try to discover new things about it?
Yeah, well, thank you for the generous question. I was very young when the song came out. I was 2 years old, and so I wasn't in the thick of things. But my parents, who were Vietnamese refugees, they barely spoke a lick of English, but they had Kenny Rogers albums, Lionel Richie albums. So when I was growing up, I just remember them playing those records, and We Are the World was somewhat of a background music to when they were cooking our dinner. And so that sort of reverberated over time. But over the course of making this film, the song has become more than a song to me. It's become an example of the power of art, of culture, of music, what it means to kind of let go of ego. And, there's, at the time, it was 46 of the biggest musical icons in the world who came together and made a song. Like, Bob Dylan is literally singing a Michael Jackson written song, right? And Lionel Richie wrote it as well. So, just for them to kind of drop everything to make this song is, I think, such a pure example of what, people can do just a little bit to kind of make people's lives better. I think there's a lot of cynicism to think if you did this, but you didn't save the world, then what's the point in doing it? I think for a lot of these artists, they saw themselves, they're singers, they're songwriters, they're musicians, and they use their talents, their skill sets to make a better world in their eyes. And I think that was something that drew me in. And it's something that I hope, the film, when it premieres tonight and when it comes out on Netflix, can inspire a generation to think of what are the things that we can do within our own, daily lives, within proximity to ourselves to help others.
Yeah, it occurs to me just in listening to your history with that song and what that moment was, the night when all of those artists came together, that there are two key things that I feel like are different today than in that room, in that studio all those years ago. One of them is that many generations of artists in the entertainment industry have found their voice around different social issues since then, right? They've been involved in collective projects like We Are the World, but also real, long, steady activism, right? Even to today, we can all name artists who are in all sorts of positions inside of the industry who are using their voice and their stories in that way. And the other thing that's changed is that I think, the movement, right? The voice and the analysis and perspective of social justice and human rights movements has evolved, and the power of those movements to say, this is the most just and authentic and accountable way to tell the stories of the injustice has grown, right? So there's a level of accountability to the people directly impacted by the issues that are being explored in a song like "We Are the World" today. That's very different than it was at that time. And it makes me think about something that you raised, Richa, which is this idea of context and community around your activism. You talked about realizing you were the only one in the movement that was speaking out, and I think that there are a lot of other artists who have had that experience of raising a voice and realizing there's not a choir yet, right? But I'm really wondering how your visible and intentional choices to integrate social justice and human rights and activism into your lives and work have allowed you to live and find home inside of communities outside of the typical entertainment communities. Are there more actors or filmmakers, writers who are rising up with you in these moments? What kind of organizational partners or community partners have you been able to engage with because of the way that you are now approaching your art? And anyone is welcome. Richa.
I didn't mean to say I was the only one. I wanted to say maybe we started with a choir and then everyone went silent and I was the only one singing. And the rest of the choir slowly realized that the only way they could continue to be relevant activists was if they actively became politicians, which is not something I wanted to do. I'm not a politician. I don't want to be standing for elections, and I want to create art. I want to tell meaningful stories. I really think that sometimes a really beautiful, impactful film can move more people than an election speech or a manifesto. That's my personal belief. Because of the way things are right now, and because of how much my husband is staring at me, worried that I might be arrested as soon as I land, I will say that I don't think that much exists outside in terms of organizational setups. And we have to remember that this is America. You're all educated. But when I go back and talk to India, I have to talk to maybe 40% of the population that is still illiterate, and I have to make my communication accessible to them. So sometimes I choose to do mainstream stuff with songs and dances that can get the message across because it's sugar-coated and packaged in a very glamorous way. But when we come here with a film like Girls Will Be Girls that directly takes on patriarchy, we have to make sure it's slice of life and it's cute about teenage sexuality and about a little bit of jealousy and about... So basically you find ways to tell the stories that you think will touch people somewhere, because I think that that's really it. There's a power that comes from submission, that where someone is afraid of you. And that's really what leaders use, that you would be arrested, incarcerated, killed. Like last year in 2022, 2 big singer actors were assassinated in the north of India in a road accident and in a gang war. We know what that means. But so I forgot what I was saying. Sorry. I have brain fog from jet lag. Yeah, basically, I'll just end.
Can I actually? Do you mind if I never to steal a job? Can I ask a follow-up question? Because I'm so struck and really moved by hearing about the political context that you make art in, which has real personal rigors that mine frankly doesn't, and it makes it creates, I think, a higher stakes version of a question I wrestle with a lot, and so I'm just curious your and everybody's answer to it, which is what moves the needle, right? What political art actually has an impact on people in the world, right? What changes opinions? What makes things better in a concrete way, right? Which is a question I'm constantly asking myself, as you can hear from my opening answer about some of the ambivalence I have about whether or not some of the more didactic and direct political art is in fact effective in the first instance. So that's all to say, when the stakes are so high for you, in terms of engaging in activist art and political art, how do you sort of assess what the positive political impact of your work is?
I mean, it's easy to gauge, actually, when you meet people right after they see a film. I'll give you an example. In 2006-07, there was a very commercial film in India called Rang De Basanti, and it was super commercial. It had lots of big stars, and it had tons of great music. But there was this case about there was a murder case that was basically lying dormant. And something about that film, even though it was not directly correlated, it just moved people into coming out in large numbers and demanding justice for this one particular dormant murder case, and justice was served. So you never know, sometimes we feel like we're the only ones who are thinking like this, but other people may not have the platform or the privilege or the power to articulate. And so when you give them a little spark, something gets ignited and they get strength in that. And that's why it's also so important to keep speaking up. We try to circumnavigate the rules all the time, even for the film that we've just produced, even though it's super, super subversive and it's about sexuality and also about a mother's sexuality. In India, mother is Ma, and no, she's an asexual creature worthy of worship, and she has no desire of her own. The minute she pops a baby, that's it. And now you know why we have such a huge population, but whatever. But the thing is, even on that film, because of the policies and how nerdy we were about them, we took a subsidy from the government. So, the same regime that sort of comes after artists in different ways ended up giving us some money. So we'll just find ways, I guess, with humor and...
Bao, did you want to jump in there?
Yeah, could I just follow up on that question? As I mentioned before, my parents are refugees from Vietnam, and they escaped from the war. So I have, for the past 10 years or now, been making films in Vietnam. It's been a sort of interesting dichotomy of working here versus working in Vietnam. And my last film in Vietnam was initially banned by the government, and it came out after a few changes. But I'm always curious when I'm such a nerd and student of history, of the first groups of people that are usually jailed and censored and in prison are the poets, the writers, the artists, right? And as much as we don't want to think about our art having impact, maybe the people who are fearful of our art know the impact sometimes of just having a spark, of inspiring something. And I think that is the power of culture. I think culture is a reflection. It's a set of our values that we all sort of agree on. And so as culture makers, we are helping to promote those values to the larger world in many ways. And again, not to be self-aggrandizing about art, but I think when I look at art, other people's art, that's the power of it for me, as even just as a viewer. And so even with the song We Are the World, that kind of, there was do they know it's Christmas right before that? And that movement of We Are the World, do they know it's Christmas right before, just sparked Band-Aid and Farm Aid and all these movements where artists saw their, again, ability to kind of help people in a collective way. And I think, again, if it's a spark that can be created, that's enough.
Yeah, that's interesting. There's... Oh, yeah, go, please.
I have kind of not a different view, but a wrinkle to that, which is I think in the U.S. at least, I can only speak to the States, I feel like a lot of the art that's created with or without the intention of having an impact, but people are describing it as such, it really just kind of is seen by the folks that generally already agree with that, right? And so I'm kind of always struggling with how do you make art that can have an impact, that is art you want to make, that doesn't just speak to the folks that you already talk to every day. And I feel like when We Are the World came out, that's something that everybody watched, right? But everybody doesn't watch anything anymore. And so I feel like the way we measure the change is less about one particular thing, but I feel like it's just accumulation over time. usually not a single street protest is not necessarily going to change policy, but like sustained protest over time in different communities is going to make change. And it feels kind of similarly about film and TV specifically.
But I think I think that's a really useful point, and I think it helps put the finger on, I think, one of the cross-cultural differences in this conversation, because a lot of the art that's labeled as activist art and political art, I think, is quite repetitive in America of other speech that's absolutely allowed and absolutely echoed from powerful pulpits in other places. But the thing that really resonates with me in what you're saying, and I think it's part of what you're speaking to as well, is that there's something about this image of a spark, of it galvanizing an energy that's already there in the people. But I think also as artists, striving to do something that's revelatory or something that's on the vanguard, it's about galvanizing something that maybe hasn't had a voice elsewhere and hasn't had a voice without this piece of art, either because of explicit government suppression in certain cases, or I think in a US context, perhaps less because of that and more because the nature of some of the insidious narratives floating around hasn't allowed for this real meaningful political sentiment to get voiced in that particular way. So I think there is really something there about tapping into an energy that no one's quite said out loud before or been allowed to say out loud.
One of the great sort of like delights of a moderator of a panel is when you don't have to ask a question. And this is a group that just has so much chemistry and so much to talk about that I had a feeling that this was going to be a robust conversation, and I love it. I wanted to just share a couple of things. One is that idea of the spark that a piece of art can actually spark something that's like brewing under the surface and make it grow. It is one of the ways that we think about the role of narrative oceans. That one story dropped into an ocean becomes like a drop of ink that swirls, has its own little energy, and then it gets consumed by the waves. But many stories working with each other, talking to each other, becoming real cultural material power in the world begins to actually create different momentum. One of our grantees, America Ferreira, she once described this idea. She said, change is like the bubbles in the bottom of a pot when you start to boil it, right? So each story is a bubble, and those bubbles start to bounce up against each other, and it is the energy between the bubbles that ultimately changes the composition of the water. And so thinking about how does your story become a bubble, a strong enough, powerful enough bubble inside of that water, and then what is the relationship, the dialogue, the chemistry between different stories that begin to call and response each other to create this immersive environment. And that makes me want to ask all of you, what, if the goal is actually to not be on your own, and to not be releasing your story into an ocean that will gobble it up, but to actually be in community and context with each other, what are the kinds of things that would need to change in your industries for you to be able to be working in context and in community?
Well, you gotta go first.
I know.
My industry is 50 years away from this question, so I laughed.
For me, I think like intersectionality is so important. Like knowing that even though we come from different experiences, there's something unique in sort of the struggle of our communities. I don't think I know for sure the Asian American community wouldn't be where it is without the Black community and many other communities that came before to pave the way to kind of give us that spark, right? And I think we have to keep on encouraging each other and leaning on each other as much as possible. I think like the idea of like individualism in America is quite dangerous because, we are the United States of America. And I lean on that so much because I've been inspired by, I mean, even, the case of We Are the World, not to keep on dropping my film, sorry, but to pay respect to the OG, artist activist Harry Belafonte in many ways, right? Rest in peace. And the road that he's paved for all of us who consider themselves artist activists. The term artist activist is something I don't kind of hold on to. Yo-Yo Ma has this idea of citizen artists, and I think as just citizens of a country, there's the least that we can do as a people. And I think there's amazing activists out there who are really doing the work on the ground, and we are, as storytellers, as filmmakers, as artists, we want to just, again, work in community with them. So the real work, the policy work, all these things that have to happen for tangible changes to take place.
Kobi, did you want to join in?
Yeah, the one thing I would add is I think it would be really helpful if the industry let go of their expectations of what work by people of color looked like. Because I often run into these sort of antiquated archetypes of what, in my case, a black film should be, and some of the films that are being referenced are films that I love and think that are beautiful, but they're also 20, 30, 40, 50-year-old films, right? And the conversation has changed. And to me, the political the conversation around race in America it needs different aesthetic tools, and it needs different voices, and it needs additions to those, in some cases, very sort of well-trod types of, again, in my case, black films. And to me, there's a real fear in a lot of Hollywood decision-making, which is very understandable because there's a lot of money on the line. But I think the knee-jerk reaction is to look back at what worked before and try to do something very similar to that again, as opposed to having the courage to say, well, okay, a black film in 2024 might look different than a black film in 2020 looked like. And if our leaders and financiers would have a little bit more courage in not being stuck in the way art by people of color used to look, and could let us sort of be a little bit more the vanguard, I really think that would do tremendous positive work for the world.
Mm-hmm. Nik, did you want to share?
I think there's a million things the industry could do, but I think a couple of the big ones. One is invest in independent film. I think getting more money into the independent space will just empower so many more people of color and queer people and women, and give us the tools needed to have a better shot at the fight in the studio system. And then I think we need to kind of re-examine the money that we're spending on DE&I initiatives. And I say this as someone who started a mentorship program for South Asian folks. A lot of these programs have just been ineffective. And if you look at any of the research that comes out of USC Annenberg and the data, the numbers really haven't changed all that much. And with the contraction happening, we're probably going to see a dip in diverse content. And I don't know what the answer is, but I feel like that money could be spent well in early development pipelines, like film schools and high school programs, to get folks from communities of color and other communities into the industry. And I think figuring out distribution in a way, I don't know what the answer is to that, but finding some sort of independent, democratized distribution that works for everybody, including artists and financiers and audiences. I really don't know what the fuck that is, but I think it's a worthy cause that smarter people should be working on.
Yeah. I think that there are artists in the industry who have had the experiences with some of the DEI programs that have taken the approach that particularly BIPOC artists, queer and trans, disabled artists are lacking something that needs to be taught or filled or refined, rather than naming the systems of inequity that are at work in the industry that are simply preventing those artists from doing what they are perfectly capable of doing, right? Yeah, and so, there are artists who are like leaping over those solutions and creating new ones. I think about the work that Issa Rae has done in creating the color creative management and production outfit. Samir Gardezi and Break the Room, creating a very different pathway for screenwriters into writers' rooms and development contracts. Really, just naming that the barrier to overcome is the injustice, right? Not a lack of preparation or education, and so that's an exciting kind of emergent ecosystem of artists in the industry who are actually like toppling the assumptions of what the solutions should be, and I'm encouraged by that, and really proud of being able that the collaborative has been able to support many of those artists.
It's such a, can I just add to that? It's such a good point. I've never thought about it that way before, but it is so patronizing and insidious. The suggestion that, oh, the issue is we just don't know enough, right? And the piece I want to add to that the point which stands beautifully on its own is that I think the negative space of that from people in power is there's an implication that they got where they are by merit, right? The system's not wrong, because if the system were wrong and unfair, it would mean I, person currently in power, did not earn the place that I had. So it must be that these young people of color need to just be trained better somehow, right? As opposed to saying, no, it's just straight up the opportunity, that the opportunity and the absence of the opportunity is as much the issue as anything else. Yeah.
Yes, please.
So last year when we were trying to make our film, we wanted an all-female crew. And we realized that in India, there are no female light women, because grips is considered to be a job where, you have to do the heavy lifting, and women are so weak. But it's the women primarily who do like 70% of the farming, when they're the ones who walk miles to fill pots and pots of water and walk miles with those on their head. No one questions that. But anyway, so there were no female light women in India, apart from there was one gaffer, and not to take away credit from her, but her father was a very renowned gaffer, and he set up a nice lighting company, etc. So we came up with this laughable idea. We were like, oh, it's going to be a laugh. No one's going to do it, and no one's going to invest in it. But let's start a program where we take 10 girls and we sort of train them in lighting and storytelling through lighting. And we called it the Undercurrent program. And really just for a laugh, we admitted it in the Berlinale. Like they had 2 scholarships, and we won one of them. And then we had this workshop where we trained 10 light women, and then one of them was absorbed into our film. And 2 girls were from a tribal background, like indigenous background in India. So we had to have translators from them, and they were from villages that didn't even have proper network, like mobile phone network. And now they're working as light women in the industry, doing the heavy lifting. One of them has piercings also. It's all really cool. We feel very happy. But it's a small thing. We're going to have the 2nd edition for that this year.
It's a perfect example of, when we launched the collaborative, we talked to artists. We said, what do you want? What do you need? And across the board, the response that we got was, I don't necessarily need something for my career per se. I need support to bust through the barriers that are preventing progress for me and another artist like me. And they had the solutions, right? Like this is a very clear example of a solution that just busts right through the social norms and the systems at work. And that is the new day, the new space that we are all in at the intersection of entertainment and activism, is that we have some resources, we have infrastructure, we have community to have an idea for a solution and to act upon it, and to do so not by ourselves, but with each other, and to build power through our sort of collective vision and creativity. As we're coming to a close in this conversation, I wanted to ask each of you, if you could look forward and share what you believe to be the sort of next horizon of work, either for yourself or for artists more broadly, the next horizon of work at the intersection of making art, telling stories, and making change in the world. What are you hoping for? What are you seeing on the horizon?
Yeah, I'll jump in to talk about the future. I want to pick up on the word you used earlier about just with intersectionality. You know, to me, that's something I really strive for in my work in terms of not just thinking through my own experience and the experience of other, Black people or people that are close to my experience, but trying to build these broader coalitions of, people of color, other people that have gone through similar things to myself, and expand my own understanding of what they've gone through, and not just tell my story, but tell my story and try to more deliberately find ways that story resonates with other people in other communities. And that's partially just because that's an interest of mine, but also quite selfishly, I want other people to do that for me. Right, and I want other filmmakers and other people from other communities to be thinking about my experience and taking me seriously, and taking my experience seriously, and quite deliberately trying to write for me and recognize and respect my experience, even if it's very different from theirs. And my sort of hope for the future is that if we're all doing that to a much greater extent, then all of our communities will be sort of lifted up by that process.
Nik?
This is a question I kind of struggle with a lot, because there's so many different paths you can take, and as an individual, you can only do so much. But I think, for me, I think the only issue I really consider myself like an advocate on is South Asian representation, and I'm particularly interested in figuring out how to unlock financing that exists outside the industry for independent projects for our community. The South Asian community in the U.S. has so much money and so much capital, and it's just there's a barrier. And I think like a lot of the really incredible films you've seen from the Black community, the Latina community, the East Asian community, other communities, it comes because folks in their community invested in it. Because at the end of the day, it sucks, but like at the end of the day, it is a business, and like the financial side of it needs to happen. But on top of that, it's not just the money. It's also like investing that money with a tolerance for risk. I think, to your point, like not having expectations in stone about what this project is going to be, or how it's going to be received, or how exactly it's going to land in like the online ecosystem or what have you, and just let artists be artists, and also to let producers be a little more risky. And what I mean by that is, so I just made this short. We were very lucky to have a good chunk of change from outside the industry, from people of color. It's 100% financed by people of color. And yeah, they some of them are in the room. They let me and our producers do a lot of things just on like the back end that was very nice, but it cost money. So we, it was a short, so I think the expectation a lot of the time is to like call in a lot of favors and not really pay people that well. But we were like, no, we're gonna pay everyone like their rate or a little bit more. We're gonna have people not do 2 jobs, right? If we need 2 drivers, we're gonna get 2 drivers, not have 1 driver do 18 hours. And we also created a department called Department of Crew Experience, which was like a 2-person department that was completely dedicated to crew well-being. Because another thing that we did was our crew was like majority POC, but that meant that a lot of the folks on there were pretty green, and they hadn't had a lot of experience. And I think I've seen it as an actor where you see these like less experienced people of color, they aren't given the space to make mistakes and learn. Oftentimes they just make a mistake and then they're never hired again, and they don't really have space on set to figure things out. And so that's kind of what that department was meant to do. But all of that cost money, right? We had to pay these people, and I just want like investors to be more risky and specifically from our community, because I don't think like the studio system or other communities are going to do what we need. And that's not a knock on anything. It's just the way it is.
Richa?
Oh, representation is really far away goal right now. Before I die, I would like to see syndication happen in the Indian film industry. It's really prolific, but a lot of artists get like a one-time fee for their work. And so they're unable to take any political stands at all, because the minute you open your mouth, you're fired. And if you have the cushioning of some kind of royalty or some kind of IP that you can hold on to, it makes you braver. So I think that I would love to, really get behind that and make people see value in it, because someone somewhere is making money off of a film I did 10 years ago, for which I was paid like 2 lakhs or what is 2 lakhs? $2,000, 10 years ago. So that's the thing that I want to get behind, and just bring in more organization, because the minute you have that and the minute you have data, then you can see how many women work in this, how many lower caste people are employed in these jobs, how many shifts are they pulling, are people being paid on time, do they have medical leave, do they have insurance and things like that. So that's something that I really do want to work on. It's a long, lofty goal, but I'll make sure it happens.
For the future, this is something you touched upon earlier, is like thinking about how we can liberate ourselves from like the narratives that we've been held captive to for so long. One of my favorite films of this year, I guess last year, was American Fiction, which sort of like satirizes so well. And I think for me as, a child of, war refugees, there's been this expectation, memoir sells really well for BIPOC audiences, and for general audiences of BIPOC artists, right? That's, everyone tells me, oh, make a film about the Vietnam War or something like that. But I'm sort of like tired, and I think these stories still need to be told. But I'm tired of being like the narrator and the tour guide of my world of trauma. I want to build my own world, like a new world. I want to make like Lord of the Rings for the Asians, or like Star Wars. Like how can we liberate ourselves and stop self-censoring ourselves to like, these are the stories that we have to tell.
Ah, wow. So that's our future work. I took some notes because I want to be in this future work. I heard I want to be seen outside of the very narrow boxes as an artist, outside of the boxes that the industry sometimes places, particularly on historically excluded artists. I want to be financed at the level that allows us to bring justice and dignity and care to our sets and to our workplaces and into our art. I want economic justice. That's what I heard, Richa. The ability to have longevity and have a real, just, and equitable stake in the resources that are being generated from your work, and narrative transformation and liberation, in cultural liberation, the ability to tell the stories we want to tell outside of the sort of colonized confines of the world as it is today. So if you are up for that work, these are the people to talk to. I am so energized by that vision of the future. I am so thankful to the Sunrise Collective and Gold House, the Asian American Foundation, 3AD, for inviting us to have this incredible conversation, to all of you for sticking with it and being here with us for the past hour, and to all of these brilliant speakers. Will you give them a round of applause for sharing? Thanks so much.
And thank you, Bridget.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.